The night was unusually cold for October. Officer Mike Taylor rubbed his tired eyes as he drove through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge. He had been working for almost 16 hours straight, and his body ached for rest. But when the call came in about a possible break-in at Chen's restaurant on Oak Street, he knew sleep would have to wait. Dispatched to Unit 14, we have reports of suspicious activity behind Chen's restaurant. Possible break-in in progress, crackled the radio. Mike's heart rate picked up. This was the third break-in reported this week. The small business owners in town were getting desperate for police to catch whoever was responsible. Unit 14 responding, he replied, flipping on his lights but keeping the siren silent. He didn't want to alert the suspect. As he pulled into the alley behind the restaurant, his headlights swept across a dark figure near the back door. The person was dressed in dark clothes and appeared to be trying to get inside. Mike's exhaustion vanished in an instant, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He quietly stepped out of his patrol car, hand resting on his holster. "Police, don't move," he shouted, drawing his weapon and pointing it toward the ground. The figure turned suddenly, something metallic glinting in his hand. Mike's training kicked in. In 3 quick steps, he closed the distance and tackled the man to the ground. The impact was hard, and he heard the man grunt in pain. "I said don't move," Mike shouted, his knee pressing into the man's back as he grabbed for his wrists. "Hands behind your back now." "Wait, you've got this all wrong." The man's voice was muffled against the pavement. "I work here. I'm trying to help." But Mike wasn't listening. Too many officers got hurt giving suspects the benefit of the doubt. He secured the handcuffs and then flipped the man over, shining his flashlight on his face. The man squinted against the bright light. He was black, in his mid-30s, with a look of confusion and anger in his eyes. It was then that Mike noticed something odd about his jacket. There was a patch on the sleeve. "What's that on your jacket?" Mike asked, the first hint of doubt creeping into his mind. "I've been trying to tell you, I'm a firefighter. I'm Lieutenant David Johnson from Station 8. Mike's flashlight beam moved across the jacket, revealing the firefighter patch. His stomach dropped. But he wasn't ready to back down yet. "If you're a firefighter, what are you doing breaking into this restaurant at 11:30 at night?" David took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the handcuffs digging into his wrists. "I'm friends with Mr. Chen. I was driving home from my shift when I saw what looked like smoke coming from their kitchen exhaust. I called Mr. Chen, and he asked me to check it out using the spare key he gave me months ago." Mike looked toward the restaurant and noticed for the first time the faint wisps of smoke rising from the roof vent. His chest tightened. "The key is in my right pocket," David continued, "along with my firefighter ID. Check if you don't believe me." Keeping one hand on his weapon, Mike carefully retrieved the key and a wallet from David's pocket. Inside the wallet was an official firefighter identification card with David's photo. Next to it was a photo of David in full firefighter gear, posing with what looked like his family. The sound of another car pulling up made both men turn. A small sedan screeched to a halt, and an older Asian man jumped out. Officer, what are you doing to Lieutenant Johnson?" Mr. Chen shouted as he ran toward them. "He is here because I asked him to check on my restaurant. There might be a fire." Mike's face flushed hot with embarrassment and regret. He quickly removed the handcuffs from David's wrists. "I'm sorry, sir. There was a report of a break-in, and I—" David slowly stood up, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had been. His eyes met Mike's, not with hatred, but with something more complicated, disappointment mixed with understanding. "Let's just check out that smoke," David said quietly. "That's why I came here in the first place." And in that moment, Mike realized his terrible mistake, one that would change both their lives forever. David's shoulder throbbed as he followed Mr. Chen to the back door of the restaurant. The pain shot down his arm, a reminder of how hard Officer Taylor had tackled him to the ground. But right now, there were more important things to worry about. "I smelled something electrical burning when I walked by," David explained, his firefighter instincts taking over despite what had just happened. "Like plastic or wires overheating." Mr. Chen unlocked the door with his own key. "My wife said the lights were flickering before she left tonight. I told her it was nothing to worry about." Worry lines creased his forehead as he pushed the door open. Officer Taylor stood awkwardly behind them, his face still flushed with embarrassment. "Do you want me to call the fire department?" he asked. David shook his head. "Let me check first. Might be nothing serious." His voice was cool and professional, but inside, anger and humiliation churned in his stomach. 15 years as a firefighter, 8 as a lieutenant, and this was how he was treated in his own community. The three men stepped into the dark kitchen. David flipped on his flashlight and immediately spotted wisps of smoke coming from an electrical panel near the walk-in refrigerator. "There's our problem," he said, moving quickly toward it. "Mr. Chen, where's your main breaker?" While Mr. Chen showed David the electrical box, Officer Taylor stood by the door watching. His radio crackled to life. "Unit 14, what's your status on that possible break-in?" Taylor stepped outside to respond. "False alarm. The individual has been identified as fire department personnel checking on a possible electrical issue." "Copy that. Be advised we're getting calls about a police incident at that location. Apparently, someone recorded the takedown and it's already on social media." Taylor's blood ran cold. He stepped back inside to find David shutting off power to part of the restaurant. "I've isolated the circuit that was overheating," David explained to Mr. Chen. "You'll need an electrician first thing tomorrow, but this should prevent any fire hazard tonight." "Thank you, Lieutenant Johnson. You may have saved my business," Mr. Chen said gratefully. "Your father would be so proud." David nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. His late father had been Pine Ridge's first black fire chief, a man respected throughout the community. The thought of what his father would say about tonight's events made his smile fade quickly. As they stepped outside, David noticed a small crowd had gathered. Several people had phones pointed in their direction. One woman rushed forward. Lisa Wong, a reporter for the local news. "Lieutenant Johnson, are you okay? We received footage of your arrest. Would you like to comment?" David stared at her, then at the growing crowd. "What footage?" A young man stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I was walking by when it happened. I recorded it because, well, you know how these things go sometimes." David took the phone. The video showed the entire takedown from across the street. Even in the dim lighting, it clearly showed Officer Taylor tackling him without warning, pressing his face into the pavement and handcuffing him, all while David offered no resistance. The video had already been shared hundreds of times. Comments were flooding in, many from people who recognized David from when he rescued the Henderson family from their burning home last month. The story had been featured on the local news for days. Officer Taylor looked at the video over David's shoulder, his face growing pale. I didn't." "Save it," David said quietly, handing the phone back. He turned to the crowd. "There's no story here, just a misunderstanding. Officer Taylor was responding to a reported break-in, and I happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." But even as he said it, David knew this wouldn't simply go away. The hurt and anger he felt were too real. The stares from the crowd too knowing. The ache in his shoulder too sharp. "My friend Mr. Chen had an electrical issue that could have caused a fire. That's been handled now. Everyone can go home," David continued, his voice firm but tired. As the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, David turned to face Officer Taylor. Their eyes met, and in that moment, both men knew that what happened next would define not just their relationship, but potentially the relationship between the police and the community they both served. The next morning, Officer Taylor sat in Police Chief Wilson's office, staring at the floor. The video of him tackling Lieutenant Johnson had reached over 50,000 views overnight. "What were you thinking, Mike?" Chief Wilson asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You tackled a respected firefighter who was trying to prevent a disaster." "I thought he was breaking in, sir. There have been 3 break-ins this week in that area, and when I saw him at the back door." "So you tackled him without identifying yourself properly or giving him a chance to explain?" The chief's voice rose slightly. "Do you have any idea who Lieutenant Johnson is?" Mike shook his head slowly. Chief Wilson sighed and turned his computer monitor so Mike could see. On the screen was a news article from just 3 weeks ago. The headline read, "Local Hero. Lieutenant saves family of 4 from burning building." Next to it was a photo of Lieutenant Johnson, his face streaked with soot, carrying a small child from a burning apartment building. He ran back into that fire 3 times, Chief Wilson said. The last time, the roof was already starting to collapse. He saved that entire family while most people would have been running the other way. Mike felt sick to his stomach. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a physical force. I've received calls from the mayor, the fire chief, and about a dozen community leaders this morning, Chief Wilson continued. They want your badge, Mike. I understand, sir, Mike said quietly. I'm placing you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a full investigation. The chief handed him a formal notice. Turn in your badge and gun before you leave today. As Mike left the chief's office, the stares from his fellow officers burned into his back. No one said a word to him. In the locker room, he opened his locker and slowly removed his personal items. 15 years on the force, and it might all be over because of one terrible mistake. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. Have you seen the news? Call me. He couldn't bring himself to call her yet. Instead, he drove across town to Station 8 of the fire department. His heart pounded as he parked his personal car and walked to the entrance. A tall firefighter blocked his way at the door. You've got some nerve showing up here, Officer Taylor. I need to talk to Lieutenant Johnson, Mike said. Please. He doesn't want to talk to you, the firefighter replied coldly. Just then, David Johnson appeared behind him. It's okay, Tony. I'll hear what he has to say. David led Mike to a small break room and closed the door. His arm was in a sling. Your shoulder, Mike started. Sprained from the takedown, David said matter-of-factly. Doctor says I'll be on light duty for at least 2 weeks. Mike took a deep breath. I came to apologize. I made a terrible mistake last night, and there's no excuse for it. I should have identified myself clearly and given you a chance to explain before I acted. David studied him for a long moment. Do you know what my 9-year-old son asked me this morning? He asked if the police were going to hurt him too someday. How am I supposed to answer that? Mike felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. I don't know, he admitted. I'd give anything to undo what happened. But you can't, David said, and now we both have to live with it. He paused, looking out the window at the fire trucks. You know what the worst part is? I spent my whole career building trust in this community, showing kids that they can trust people in uniform. And in 10 seconds, you undid years of that work. The truth of those words hit Mike like a physical blow. He realized then that his mistake wasn't just about one wrong arrest or one injured firefighter. It was about breaking the fragile trust between the community and those sworn to protect it. The chief put me on administrative leave, Mike said. I'll probably lose my job. David shook his head slowly. Losing your job won't fix this, Officer Taylor. The question is, what are you going to do to make it right? 3 days had passed since the incident, and the story had now gone beyond their small town. National news outlets picked up the video, and social media was flooded with hashtags demanding justice for Lieutenant Johnson. Outside the police station, a small but growing crowd of protesters held signs and chanted. Mike sat on his living room couch, staring at his phone. The screen showed yet another news article about him. The headline read, Officer who attacked hero firefighter has history of excessive force. It wasn't even true. He'd never had a single complaint about excessive force in his file, but the question mark at the end allowed them to run the story anyway. You need to eat something, his wife Diane said, placing a sandwich next to him. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes showed her worry. She had stood by him through long shifts and dangerous situations, but this was different. The looks she got at the grocery store, the whispers from neighbors, the phone calls from relatives asking what happened, it was taking a toll on her too. I'm not hungry, Mike said. Well, I'm not letting you waste away while you figure this out, she insisted. Eat. Mike took a small bite to please her. As he chewed, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello. Officer Taylor. This is Reverend Williams from Community Baptist Church. Mike sat up straighter. Reverend Williams was one of the most respected voices in the local black community. Yes, Reverend. What can I do for you? I'm organizing a community meeting tonight at the church. Lieutenant Johnson will be there. I think it would be good if you came too. Mike's heart raced. A public meeting? Reverend, people are pretty angry right now. I'm not sure that's... People are angry because they don't know what happens next, the Reverend interrupted. They're angry because they've seen this story before, and they know how it usually ends. Nothing changes. I'm offering you a chance to show them something different. After hanging up, Mike paced the room, his mind racing. Going to that meeting felt like walking into a lion's den, but staying home meant hiding. You should go, Diane said, reading his thoughts as she often did after 15 years of marriage. It could get ugly. It already is ugly, she replied, but hiding won't fix that. 8 o'clock found Mike standing at the back of Community Baptist Church. The wooden pews were packed with people, many wearing Firefighter t-shirts or holding handmade signs. Lieutenant Johnson sat near the front, his arm still in a sling. His wife and young son sat beside him. Reverend Williams spotted Mike and motioned him forward. A hush fell over the crowd as Mike walked down the center aisle. Some people glared, others whispered behind their hands. Mike kept his eyes forward, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. "Thank you all for coming," Reverend Williams began. "We're here tonight because something happened in our community that hurt us all. But we're also here because we believe in healing and in justice." He turned to Mike. "Officer Taylor has asked to speak to you all directly. I'm asking you to listen with open hearts." Mike stepped up to the podium, his mouth dry. He had practiced what to say a dozen times, but now all his prepared words fled his mind. Looking out at the sea of faces, angry, hurt, suspicious, he knew that only raw honesty would do. "I made a terrible mistake," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I saw Lieutenant Johnson at that door, and I didn't see a hero firefighter. I didn't see a father, a husband, or a respected member of this community. In that moment, all I saw was a threat, and that's the problem." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mike continued, "I could stand here and talk about being tired from a double shift. I could mention the break-ins in the area, but those aren't excuses. The truth is, I failed that night. I failed Lieutenant Johnson, I failed this community, and I failed myself." He turned to look directly at David Johnson. "I don't expect forgiveness. What I did was wrong. But I promise you this, I'm not walking away from what happened. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm committed to making this right." The church fell silent after Mike finished speaking. You could have heard a pin drop. Then, from the back, someone slow clapped. Others joined in, not enthusiastically, but respectfully, acknowledging his courage to face them. Reverend Williams returned to the podium. "Thank you, Officer Taylor. Lieutenant Johnson, would you like to speak?" David stood up slowly, his injured shoulder still causing him pain. As he walked to the front, his young son watched with wide eyes. "I've been a firefighter for 15 years, David began. In that time, I've run into burning buildings. I've pulled people from car wrecks. I've performed CPR on babies. But nothing scared me as much as being face down on that pavement, unable to explain myself." His voice was steady, but emotion ran through his words. "I wasn't just scared for myself. I was scared for what my son saw in that video. I was scared for what my neighbors thought. I was scared because in that moment, my uniform, my badge, my years of service, none of it mattered." David looked directly at Mike. "Officer Taylor says he made a mistake. I believe him. But this isn't just about one officer or one incident. This is about trust. Trust that's been broken not just in Pine Ridge, but in communities across this country." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some people nodded their heads. "So where do we go from here?" David asked. "Do we just get angry? Do we demand Officer Taylor loses his job? Would that fix anything?" He paused, looking around the room. "I don't think so, because tomorrow there will be another officer on patrol who might make the same mistake. What we need is change, real change." The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. People from the community stood up to share their own experiences. A teenage boy talked about being followed around stores. A woman described being pulled over repeatedly for no reason. An older man spoke about teaching his grandsons how to behave around police to stay safe. Mike listened to every story, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. Each account hit him like a hammer blow, but he forced himself to stay present, to face these truths he had been blind to for too long. Near the end of the meeting, the police chief stood up. "I've heard enough tonight to know that we have work to do," he said. "Starting tomorrow, our department will be reviewing all our training and policies. but I also believe that Officer Taylor has shown real remorse and a willingness to learn from this incident." The chief paused, looking around the room. "Instead of firing him, I'm proposing something different. If Lieutenant Johnson agrees, I want Officer Taylor to work directly with the fire department on a special community outreach program. Let him be part of the solution." Whispers rippled through the crowd. David looked surprised. After the meeting ended, people gathered in small groups, talking intensely. David found Mike near the door. "Your chief puts you in an awkward position," David said. Mike nodded. "You don't have to agree to his idea. I understand if you want me gone." David studied him for a long moment. "My father used to say that anybody can tear something down, but it takes real courage to build something new." He glanced over at his son, who was watching them from across the room. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for him. For all the kids who need to see that change is possible." He held out his good hand. "This won't be easy. I'm still angry, and a lot of people won't understand. But if you're serious about making things right, then I'm willing to try." Mike took David's hand, feeling the weight of this unexpected second chance. "I won't let you down," he said quietly. "Don't make promises yet," David replied. "Just show up tomorrow at Station 8, 9 a.m. We've got a lot of work to do." As they parted ways, both men knew that this was just the beginning of a difficult journey, one that would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Mike parked his car outside Fire Station 8, his stomach in knots. He was 15 minutes early, but he sat in his car, watching firefighters come and go. Some glanced his way with cold stares. They knew who he was. At exactly 9 a.m., Mike walked into the station. The conversation stopped immediately. 6 firefighters turned to look at him, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. "Lieutenant Johnson is waiting for you in the conference room," said one, pointing down the hall. Mike nodded his thanks and walked through the gauntlet of stairs. He found David sitting at a table covered with papers, his injured arm still in a sling. "You showed up," David said, not looking up. "I said I would." "People say a lot of things," David replied, "especially when a crowd is watching." Mike took a seat across from him. "I meant what I said last night. All of it." David finally looked up. "Well, we'll see. I've been up all night working on this." He pushed a folder across the table. "It's a proposal for a joint training program between the police and fire departments. First responders working together to understand each other's jobs and build better relationships with the community." Mike opened the folder and began reading. The program was detailed and thoughtful, ride-alongs between police officers and firefighters, joint community events, training on de-escalation and recognition of fellow first responders. "This is impressive," Mike said genuinely. "It better be. The chief gave us 6 weeks to show results, or this whole thing gets scrapped and you're back facing a disciplinary board." The pressure of that deadline hung in the air between them. "Where do we start?" Mike asked. "With coffee," David said, standing up. "It's going to be a long day." Over the next week, Mike and David spent hours together planning their program. The tension between them slowly began to ease, not into friendship, but into a working relationship based on their shared commitment to making real change. They decided to start with a community event at the local elementary school, a Heroes Day, where kids could meet police officers and firefighters, see the equipment, and learn about safety. It was scheduled for the following Saturday. The day of the event, Mike arrived early to help set up. He was arranging chairs when David's wife, Tanya, approached him. It was the first time they had met face to face. "My husband is giving you a chance," she said without preamble. "I'm not sure I would have made the same choice." Mike nodded, understanding her frankness. "I wouldn't blame you." "He believes people can change," she continued. "He believes in second chances. Don't make him regret that." Before Mike could respond, a school bus pulled up and children began pouring out onto the playground. The event was starting. Throughout the day, Mike watched David interact with the kids. He was a natural, patient, funny, and engaging. He showed them how to stop, drop, and roll. He let them try on his helmet and explained how the different tools on a fire truck worked. When it was Mike's turn to speak to the children, he felt nervous in a way he never had before. He talked about police work, answering their questions about handcuffs and police cars. But then a small boy raised his hand. My dad says police officers are scary, the boy said. He says I should run away if I see one. The playground went quiet. Parents shifted uncomfortably. Mike knelt down to the boy's level. I'm sorry your dad feels that way, he said gently. And I'm sorry if police officers have done things that made him afraid. That's not how it should be. Police officers are supposed to help people feel safe, not scared. Some of us haven't done a good job of that, but we're trying to do better. He glanced up and caught David watching him. For the first time, there was something like respect in David's eyes. Later, as they were packing up, David approached Mike. That was a good answer you gave that kid. It was the truth, Mike replied. David nodded. You know, when we started this, I didn't think it would work. I figured you were just going through the motions to save your job. And now? David shrugged his good shoulder. Now I think maybe, just maybe, we might actually make a difference. 6 months had passed since that night behind Chen's restaurant. The leaves had fallen, winter had come and gone, and now spring brought new life to Pine Ridge. And not just to the trees and flowers. At the community center, a large banner hung above the entrance. First Annual First Responders Unity Day. Inside, the main hall was packed with people, police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and community members of all ages. David stood at the podium, his shoulder fully healed now. When we started this program 6 months ago, many people doubted it would work. Some thought it was just for show. Others said the problems between first responders and the community were too deep to fix. He paused, looking around the room. They weren't entirely wrong. The problems are deep. They won't be fixed overnight or even in 6 months. But today, I want to share what we've accomplished so far. Behind him, a screen displayed photographs. Police officers and firefighters coaching youth sports teams together. A community garden they had built in a neglected neighborhood. The new identification system for off-duty first responders that had been implemented across the county. In the past 6 months, we've trained every police officer and firefighter in this town on how to recognize each other, both in and out of uniform, David explained. We've created clearer protocols for communication between our departments. And most importantly, we've started to rebuild trust, not just between police and firefighters, but between all of us and the community we serve. David gestured to Mike, who was sitting in the front row. I'd like to invite Officer Taylor to join me. Mike walked up to the podium, and the two men stood side by side, a sight that would have seemed impossible half a year ago. Officer Taylor and I didn't plan to become partners, David said. We didn't plan to become examples, but sometimes life puts you in situations you never expected, and you have to choose what to do with them. Mike stepped up to the microphone. 6 months ago, I made the worst mistake of my career. I judged Lieutenant Johnson based on what I thought I saw, not who he really was. His voice was steady now, confident in a way it hadn't been at the church meeting. That mistake could have ended my career. It should have. But instead, it became the beginning of something important. From the audience, Mike's wife Diane watched with tears in her eyes. Beside her sat Tanya and David's son, who no longer looked at police officers with fear. The program we've built isn't perfect, Mike continued. We still have a lot to learn and a long way to go. But we've proven that change is possible when we're willing to do the hard work together. After the presentations, people mingled around tables of food prepared by local restaurants. Mr. Chen was there, proudly serving dumplings from his restaurant, the very place where it all began. You've done good work, Chief Wilson said, approaching Mike and David. The department has seen a 30% decrease in community complaints, and applications for both police and fire academies are up. It's a start, David said. As the event wound down, David found Mike helping to stack chairs. My son asked if you could come to his baseball game next weekend, David said casually. He's pitching for the first time. Mike looked surprised. I'd be honored. But are you sure he wants me there? He specifically asked for you, David replied. He says he wants to be both a firefighter and a police officer when he grows up. Apparently, you two made an impression. Mike smiled, remembering the scared boy who had watched his father get tackled to the ground. Kids are resilient. More than we give them credit for, David agreed. Sometimes they see things more clearly than we do. As they finished cleaning up, they walked out into the spring evening together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. You know, David said, my father used to say that the true measure of a person isn't how they act when things are easy. It's what they do after they've fallen down. Mike nodded, understanding the weight of those words. I'm still getting back up. We all are, David replied. Every day. They parted ways at the parking lot, not as perfect friends, but as men who had faced a painful truth together and chosen to build something new from it. Their story had become more than just a viral video or a news headline. It had become a living example of what's possible when people choose understanding over anger, growth over blame, and hope over fear.